All right, so like it says, this is the Chiasm Course, part 1. How many of you have heard of chiasms before?
I have.
Okay, so you're kind of familiar with the concept. I know for some people, this can be a brand new thing. It's just a funny sounding word that, to be honest, I'm not even pronouncing it right, but we'll get to that later. All right, so in the Chiasm Course, we've divided this into 5 parts. We're going to do 1 part each week. In part 1, which we're covering today, it's the intro to chiasms. We're going to cover different kinds of literary devices that are used in the Bible, especially parallelisms. We'll spend a little bit more time on that because they are so closely connected to chiasms. We'll talk about what chiasms are and where they appear in literature and in culture in general. And we'll talk about some extra biblical chiasms. I think I've got at least 3 in here, maybe more. And then we're going to talk about why chiasms are important, what they can tell you about the biblical text. In parts 2 through 5, we will talk about another parallelism and some more chiasms. We're going to talk about how to identify and map out a chiasm in the Bible. Then we'll take some more specific chiasms in Scripture and kind of break them out and show you how all the parts connect to each other. And then finally, we'll talk about how to use chiasms to enhance your Bible study and how to make sure that you don't use them incorrectly and get yourself into trouble. So if everybody's started, oh, somebody in the waiting room there. Welcome, Regina. All right, so intro to chiasms, let's get started. So you're all familiar with this phrase. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not. I'm sure that almost every one of you can finish that sentence. But you might not have considered that this is a chiasm. And chiasms appear all over the place in our popular culture, and we just don't think about it. We think about them as catchy slogans, but they're catchy for a reason. Oh, can you hear that?
No.
All right, somehow I lost the audio, but you'll get the idea. Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. You can see how the whole thing repeats itself in reverse order. So this is a very simple form of a chiasm. And good speechwriters, like whether JFK wrote this himself, I don't know, but good speechwriters will take advantage of patterns like this because these ideas will stick in your head easier than, if he had just described what he meant without putting it into this rhythmic pattern, it would be much harder for people to remember. In fact, it might not be a famous statement at all. It could have just gotten lost in his overall speech. But because he phrased it the way he did, saying the same thing again in reverse order, but just changing a few things here and there, that makes us remember it. And this is possibly one of the most famous sentences in the English language today. So the Bible has a lot of different literary devices. Chiasms aren't the only ones, and we'll get into more about chiasms and what what that word means and how they work a little bit later. But I want to introduce some of the other types of literary devices in Scripture because they're all relevant. They all work together, and sometimes you can find them all bunched together in a single passage. You can have a chiasm with embedded parallelisms in Anaphora and these other things, but we'll go through those words here pretty quick. Later, I'm also working on a glossary of all these terms, and I'll upload that to the Common Sense Bible Study site later. So the first one is the pun, the classic dad joke. Everybody knows what a pun is. The Hebrew Bible is full of puns. And one of the things that some linguists believe that the book of Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. For one of the early church fathers said it was. But for another thing, it seems to make use of a lot of Hebrew puns then translated to Greek, or at least that's the way it reads. So it could be just because Matthew is Jewish and he's thinking about it in Hebrew and then writing it in Greek, or because he originally wrote it in Hebrew and somebody else who didn't understand the puns translated it into Greek. It's hard to say which one it is. But puns are a very common device used, especially in Hebrew poetry, but really all over the place in the Bible. Anaphora. A lot of these are going to be obscure Greek words. Chiasm, anaphora, antimetaboly, they all sound big, like big complicated ideas, but really scholars just like to use Greek words because you can mix and match pieces of the words to come up with a label for every new idea. Anaphora literally means a back reference, and it's a repetition of an initial word or phrase. And the Beatitudes in Matthew 5 are a good example. Pull up Matthew 5 in my Bible here so I can read a couple of those. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who are hungry. Blessed are the merciful. The point of repeating this initial phrase over and over is to reference the previous phrase. So each one connects back to the one before it, which is why it's called a back reference, in Greek, anaphora. A few more literary devices from the Bible. Metonymy. This one means name swap. I think you're all probably familiar with this, even if you haven't heard of it by this label specifically. It can be used as a personal euphemism. A euphemism is something that you say instead of something else when you don't want to say the other thing. One good example is in Mark 8:33, where Jesus calls Peter Satan. Like, get thee behind me, Satan. He doesn't really mean that Peter is Satan. He's just saying that in this instance, Peter is playing the role of his adversary. He is blocking his progress in his mission as the Messiah. So he's saying, get behind me, don't stand in front of me and block my way. And he calls him Satan just as a rhetorical device, just making sure that Peter and we understand the effect that Peter is having on him if he were to actually listen to Peter. Like, no, you can't die, you're the Messiah. No, get behind me, I'm here to die. That's why I'm here. Another one in Matthew 3:9. Let me pull that one up so I can read it. Matthew 3:9. Do not presume to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father, for I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children for Abraham. Now, the metonymy in this verse isn't really obvious, but when Jesus pointed at these stones, I mean, he was literally talking about the stones, rocks on the ground or on a wall nearby. But he was also talking about people. He wasn't saying that he could take the stones and turn them into children of Abraham. He was saying that he could take people who are like stones, who have hearts of stones, or who are dead in sin, and he can make them alive. He can make them into children of Abraham. So instead of saying, pointing at the Samaritans or pointing back at the Pharisees or some other group of people who was maybe had a lot of bad theology or wasn't living a righteous life, and he could say, these are stones and I can turn them into children of Abraham. It's just a subtle example of a metonymy, a name swap, where the name of one thing is replaced with the name of another. It's a very common device used in apocalyptic literature. The book of Revelation and Daniel use a lot of metonymy, and they do this through imagery, like the Daniel's beasts. The beasts aren't actual monsters, they represent kingdoms. And parts of the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, these represent different kingdoms. So the text is saying that the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar, or the kingdom that's, the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar, sorry, I'm getting my metals switched around. He's like the head of gold. He's at the top, he's the founder. Of course, this is kind of playing on his ego, but it's also the beginning of the analogy. The Roman Empire, or whoever the iron legs represent, they represent strength and power. And this other kingdom, the one to come, is this mixed kingdom. These are all forms of metonymy where a physical object is placed instead of a kingdom. Cities are used this way. When in prophecy, frequently God will refer to Jerusalem or the daughters of Jerusalem or the daughters of Zion. Now, these are actual places, Zion or Jerusalem being the city on the holy mountain. But the daughters of Zion could be the suburbs around Zion, but it's not actually talking about the city itself. It's talking about the people who live there. So when he says, woe to you, Jerusalem, he doesn't mean woe to you, buildings and streets and walls. He means you people who live in Jerusalem. Another form, this one's a challenging one to say. Synecdoche. This one is where a part of something is given as the whole, or a whole thing is given as part of it. That sounds kind of weird, but let me explain what I mean. If we're talking about cattle, you're on a ranch, the rancher needs to count how many cows he has. He doesn't count how many cows. He says he has 50 head of cattle. Each head represents the whole cow. And that's a real common way of saying things. Like if a ship goes down, we talk about how many souls were lost. Well, the soul represents the person, the whole person. Now, you can argue exactly what the word soul means. In some contexts, it really does mean the whole person. But this also works the other direction, where the whole is given for part. Let me give you an example in 1 Timothy 6:10. For the love of money is a root of all evil. Now, it literally says the love of money is the root of all evil. But most modern translations render this all kinds of evil or something like that, because that's clearly what he meant. Lust is the root of some evil. Hatred is the root of a lot of evil. The love of money isn't the root of all evil. It's the root of, all kinds of evil. So the entire category of evil is given as a stand-in for a subclass of bad stuff, bad behavior. So that is, let me try it again, Synecdoche. All right, so Merism, I think this is the last one I'm going to talk about. Merism actually talks about partitioning, and it kind of sounds to me like a mirror, which gives you an idea of what it's about. It's actually, it literally means partitioning, but it's talking about two extremes. Like when scripture says that Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, it doesn't mean that he's just the beginning and he's just the end. It means that he's everything in between. He is everything. He is the aim of the law. He is the reason that we are created and exist. So in a merism, the two ends of a spectrum are given as stand-ins for the whole thing. There's another good example in Ecclesiastes 3, where it says, for everything there is a season, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up, a time to kill and a time to heal. It doesn't mean that there's only one or the other, that there's a time to kill and there's a time to heal and there's no time for anything in the middle. What it really means is there's a time for everything. And he does get to that eventually. There's a time, well, actually at the very beginning, for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, both the beginning and the end and everything in the middle. So that's a merism. It's a mirror where the beginning reflects the end and includes everything in between. And in a way, this is a lot like a chiasm, because there's a beginning and an end and they reflect each other. But why do people use these literary structures? First, there's aesthetics. Our brains are wired to like patterns. We like the way that rhythm, rolls off the tongue. We like alliteration, where the first parts of words sound the same, kind of like rhyming, but from the beginning of the word instead of the end of the word. It's a pleasing way to write things in patterns. We use it for mnemonics. And this is really the same reason that we use it for aesthetics. Because our brain likes it, it also makes it easier to remember. Use it for emphasis. If you think about the way that ancient writers operated, they didn't have fonts. They didn't have bold and italics and underline. Most ancient writers didn't even have upper or lower case. They just had letters. And frequently they didn't even use spaces between words. They just one letter after another letter. And so writing in patterns like parallelisms and chiasms and metonymy, all of these different formats, let them add emphasis to a text and let them add meaning. If you compare two different things, compare and contrast, I can make a statement about one thing and then follow it with a statement about the other thing and leave it up to you to realize that I'm comparing these two different things. And this is what happens in literary structures frequently. And you can get a lot more meaning out of the text if you understand how the one is related to the other. It also helps conserve resources. trying to think of a way that I can illustrate this. I don't know if you've heard about this lead tablet that was found on Mount Ebal. It's a tiny lead tablet, just a couple of centimeters wide, and it has a curse written on it. Curse are you by Yahweh. Essentially, these little amulets, frequently made of lead, were a really popular thing at one time for probably about 2,000 or 3,000 years. If you had made a covenant, or you made some kind of contract with somebody, you might create one of these curse amulets, and you'd give it to the other person, and they'd wear it around, and it would say, if you violate this covenant, these curses are going to happen to you. But this lead tablet was tiny. It was like 2 centimeters across. So there's not a lot of room. And they would use a bronze stylus or something to make little marks on it, maybe with a hammer or a rock to tap on it to make indentations in the lead. But you don't have a lot of space for writing paragraphs. You can't write lots of explanations for what you mean. So you have to rely on codes embedded in the text. This point over here is connected to this point over here. What's the relationship between them? When you understand the relationship, you can understand why the writer put them here and what he's trying to say by putting them next to each other. So you can conserve a lot of resources, parchment and papyrus. These things were very costly and time consuming to create. So it was important to use them as sparingly as possible, to conserve your words whenever you could. And even though a lot of these patterns show lots of repetition, I know that you've read the scriptures and thought, why is he repeating this? Didn't he just say that a few verses earlier? It's because the writer is arranging the text into patterns that can add meaning, can add another dimension or some depth, or create connections between different ideas that don't have to be spelled out with another paragraph of writing. Chiasms are writers in all cultures. I don't know about all cultures, but writers in many cultures, even today, use chiasms because they resonate with the way that our minds work. And in part, it's because it's the way that our life works. Use an example here. When you're born, the first part of your life is characterized by helplessness. You can't walk. You have to be carried around and taken care of. The next part of your life is characterized by maturation. You're growing physically and mentally. You're learning how to become an adult. And so the next and largest part of your life is as an adult. It's characterized by independence, by your career, by growing a family. And then you go into another maturing stage. You're not growing your family anymore. You're not growing your career. Instead, you're growing older physically. Your body's starting to break down, and you may be growing in wisdom. Hopefully you are by this time. And you're taking on a new role in your community more as an advisor instead of the muscle. And finally, at the end of your life, you are once again helpless and carried. Somebody has to take care of you. So our entire life is arranged as a chiasm. And I think this is part of God's plan. And it's one of the reasons that writers instinctively gravitate to these kinds of structures, because they really do resonate with us on multiple levels. All right, so I'm going to take another sidetrack here to parallelisms are very important. They're a very important component of chiasms, because a chiasm really is just a series of nested parallelisms. Parallelism is a sequence of repeated words or ideas, or a repeated sequence of words or ideas. It works both ways. You can say something, and then you can say the same thing again, maybe changing a couple of words to make some connections or turn it around a little bit. And this is a short, simple parallelism. Two parts of the text parallel each other, like train tracks. And it can say the same thing in two different ways, or it can say two different things in the same way. Those are both equally valid uses of parallelism. Here's an example in Proverbs 26, 4 and 5. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you become like him. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. Now, on a first reading, that sounds contradictory. How can you answer a fool according to his folly and not answer a fool according to his folly at the same time? you have to assume that the writer knew that that was a contradiction. And so think about what he really meant by that. And it's in the meditation on the potential meaning that you really get the wisdom out of this passage. He's contrasting answering a fool foolishly with answering the fool's foolishness. When you answer not a fool according to his folly, you are refraining from saying the first thing that comes to your mind. When somebody says something stupid, do you call him stupid? Probably not going to help. It's frequently my first instinct, and I have to fight it all the time. But that would be answering the fool according to his folly. Instead, you can answer him by displaying his folly to other people, which is what Jesus did frequently when he was confronted by the Pharisees. They would ask him one question, and instead of answering the question, he would turn around and answer some other question that was related. He would use their words and flip it around to say something else. And this was answering the fool according to his folly in a way that uses his folly to develop wisdom, either in the fool himself or in the people around him. All right, so back to the chiasm. See those words that scrolled across the top there? Technically, this should be pronounced chiasmus. You know, it's another Greek word. You'll see it pronounced or spelled chiasmus, chiasmi, ring structure, literary inversion. I've seen all of these words. In Greek, it's chiasmus is the singular, chiasmi is the plural. And I'm still probably pronouncing it wrong. I'm not a Greek scholar by any means. But most people, most English speakers pronounce it chiasm. So that's what I'm doing to make sure that people understand me. The name comes from the Greek letter chi, or technically chi, but again, English American pronunciation. The Greek letter chi is shaped like an X. In Hebrew, the term is atbash. And you know, the rabbis are very fond of another literary structure. They love acronyms. Some of you have probably heard the term Tanakh. The Tanakh is the Hebrew name for the Old Testament, but it's not really a word. It's actually an acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, the law, the prophets, and the writings. And so Tanakh. And in this case, this is an acronym too, but it's not an acronym made of words. It's an acronym made of letters. Aleph, Tav, Beit, Shin. Aleph is the first letter of the alphabet. Tav is the last. Beit is the second letter of the alphabet, and Shin is the second to last. So they call it an atbash. Now, a chiasm is a series of words or ideas given in one order, which sounds like the beginning of the definition of a parallelism. But then it's the same or parallel content given in reverse order. So where a parallelism gives the same idea in the same sequence twice or 3 or 4 times, a chiasm turns the order around. It will give the idea once going this way, and then it'll turn around and give the same idea going the other way. But it doesn't have to be the same idea. Sometimes it's contrasting 2 different ideas or 2 different stories or even people. So in a chiasm, the first statement is connected to the last statement is connected, or the second statement is connected to the second to the last, the third to last, and so on. This is why the Hebrew name Atbash, Aleph, Tav, Beit, Shin. Back to JFK, what your country or your country can do for you, what you, and ask. And if you look at the shape, it forms half of an X, which is part of the reason that it's called a chiasm from the Greek letter X. Now, there's actually another reason that's a little more difficult to diagram, except with the simplest of chiasms, where if you look at the Hebrew acronym Atbash, it's taking that first letter and connecting it to the last. And then it's taking the second one and connecting it to the second to the last. So you've got an X. That diagram only works with a very simple chiasm, or if you ignore all the stuff in the middle. But that's kind of like another literary structure used in the Bible, the Merism, where the first and the last represent the whole. So the Atbash is a stand-in for a more complex chiasm with more than 4 points. Does that make sense? Am I losing anybody? Okay. If you do have a question or something is confusing, go ahead and put something in the chat. I think I will probably see it. All right, so studies in alien literature. Chiasms, even though our minds frequently connect with chiasms and understand the concept intrinsically, our Western literature usually doesn't follow this pattern except in the very simplest forms. You know, we will use an antimetaboly, which is a very simple chiasm like JFK's speech, but we usually don't use chiasms in much larger text. In our modern Western literature, we will begin with the introduction, go to the body, and then do the conclusion. We use a linear progression and a logical progression. So we will start from the beginning and go to the end. And in between, we'll take a logical unit and we'll break it down and analyze it and spell it all out. Then we'll move on to the next logical block and we'll do the same thing there. And, you know, so on through the whole writing until we get to the end. Now, frequently we will introduce the topic with, you know, just like I did when we started this, told you what I'm going to tell you. And then I tell you all the stuff. And then at the end, I'm going to tell you what I already told you. So that's kind of a chiastic structure, but it's very simplistic. In our modern Western literature, we don't tend to think, or we don't tend to express ideas, at least not complex ideas, chiastically. We tend to stick with the linear logical progression. We put the climax at the end, whereas in chiastic literature, they put the climax in the middle, or the most important part in the middle. So frequently there will be an introduction at the beginning before the chiastic structure actually begins. Then there will be a series of parallels, and in the center will be an axis. Chiasms can be very asymmetrical. They don't tend to put the same amount of text in each point. Now it's a very simple one, like the antimetaboly. I can't remember if I defined that word or not. An antimetaboly is a chiasm where every word is repeated, just like in JFK's statement, just repeated in reverse order. But most chiasms in larger chunks of text will be asymmetrical. There will be a little bit of text over here in this piece and maybe a big paragraph in this point down here, but these 2 points are still parallel with each other. Chiasms don't necessarily follow a linear progression. Some do, but some don't. Frequently, rather than following a linear progression from the beginning of a story or the beginning of an idea to the end, it will have this idea and then it will recap the idea, another idea, recap that idea, or it will have a story and then get to the center, the climax of the story, and then tell the same story in reverse. Or if you think of the wilderness journey as sort of a chiastic event, they left their slavery, traveled through the wilderness to the mountain, which is the axis. Then they traveled through the wilderness and came to freedom, which is the conclusion. So they started with slavery, wilderness, mountain, wilderness, freedom. But there was a lot more time and a lot more text really after the mountain than before. So that's what I mean by asymmetrical. And that would actually be a linear progression, whereas a lot of chiasms aren't. Instead, they tend to make thematic connections between the first part and the second part, between different points. Like if a chiasm has 5 parallel levels, maybe this level over here and this level over here are saying the same thing, but using different things to, you know, different people or different concepts to do it. For example, in going back to the example of Sinai, Moses brought the children of Israel out to Sinai. And as he was doing that, Jethro, his father-in-law, was bringing his children to meet him at Sinai. So Jethro is bringing Moses' wife and children to meet him at God's mountain. Moses is bringing God's wife and children out to meet him at his mountain. And so there's a chiastic structure here, but it's not linear. It's Moses and the children of Israel, Jethro and the children of Moses, but they're leading to the central point of Sinai, which is actually in the middle of the story instead of at the end. And it's saying, it's really an illustration that God looks at Israel as his family. This is his bride and his children, depending on what point he's trying to make. Sometimes he uses the bride analogy, sometimes the children. And as I said, the climax in a chiasm is always at the center. that usually means that that's the most important point of the chiasm, is at the axis. But that's not to say that the other points aren't important. The parallels are there for a reason, and sometimes there are some really profound connections made between the points of parallels in the chiastic structure. Now, I know that this is a lot of words being thrown at you, but we're going to illustrate this later, and I think it'll really become a lot clearer as we go on. So a chiasm is like, it's this thing pointing at that thing, and they're the same thing. So an antimetaboly, here I should have defined this word earlier. And an antimetaboly is a very simple chiasm that just repeats words. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Repeats the same words, just in reverse order. And here's an example of actually 3 antimetaboly chiasms in Isaiah 5:20. Now, I copied more than just 5:20 because there's also some context here in another structure. But let's go to the middle where we see the underline. And these are 3 chiasms inside Isaiah 5:20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Now, you understand that an antimetaboly is simply the same words repeated in reverse order. So you can see that evil, good, good, evil is an antimetaboly chiasm. Darkness for light, light for darkness, bitter for sweet, sweet for bitter. But these 3 chiasms are put together because they also form a parallelism. It's a parallelism made of 3 chiasms. And each one is saying the same thing, just from a different perspective. You can think of these structures as gems. They've got all these facets and angles and planes to them, but they mean something a little bit different, or you can see another dimension to them if you turn it a little bit. The light will break up in a different pattern. You'll see different colors. So people who call evil good and good evil are the same as the people who put darkness for light and light for darkness, and who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Now, even if sometimes what God says is good seems bitter to us, it is actually sweet if we trust him, because God knows what's best for us, and it might seem bitter at the moment, but ultimately it is sweet. Sometimes we feel like we're in the dark, that we don't know what God has planned, and everything looks terrible. I mean, you look at the world around us, talk about darkness, but God has a plan. And as long as we are doing what is good, what God says is good, no matter what the consequences seem to us, that good will be light to us. But if we twist it around and we do what's right in our eyes instead of what's right in God's eyes, we might think that we're bringing enlightenment and, that we are really understanding and being kind and all of these things, but really we're walking in darkness. And that's the point of putting these 3 chiasms in parallel with each other side by side, so that we can see that good is light and sweet. Evil is dark and bitter, no matter how it seems in the moment. But look at the text that I bolded here. This is another literary structure. You'll find all over in the Bible, wherever you find literary structures, you will find embedded structures, chiasms within chiasms, parallels within parallels, parallels of chiasms. And here's one, Anaphora. Remember the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who this, blessed are those who that. That's because the one statement reflects back at the one before it. And this is the same kind of structure. Woe to those who draw iniquity. Woe to those who call evil good. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes. Woes to those who are heroes at drinking wine. This is like the reverse of Beatitudes, but it's the same literary structure, or the same kind of literary structure, rather. And I would not be surprised if you notice that there are 2 woe to those statements before that triple chiasm and another 2 after that triple chiasm. I would not be surprised if we looked at this in a lot of detail, that this anaphora, the repeated initial phrases, are actually arranged in another chiasm, so that you've got a chiasm with a triple chiasm as the axis.
That makes sense.
So structure within structure within structure. It's kind of like fingerprints in the scriptures that, I'm sure you've heard of the documentary hypothesis that most of the Bible was actually lots of different writers over long periods of time who edited and spliced in bits here and there and kind of rearranged things as they felt they needed to, usually for political reasons. Now, there's certainly been some editing and some compilation involved in the building of the scriptures, but structures like this show that a lot of those places where the school of higher criticism says that, you know, this part was written in 1000 BC by a priest, and this part was written in 200 BC by, you know, a politician, that's wrong, because the structure couldn't exist if that was the case. The structure doesn't make sense if it wasn't all written at one time. So more complex chiasms repeat themes in grammar. So an antimetaboly is the very simple chiasm, where it's just the individual words that are repeated in reverse order. More complex chiasms tend to repeat themes, sometimes grammatical structures. The grammatical structures will usually be kind of a medium complexity chiasms, but those are really hard to analyze if you don't read Hebrew fluently, which I don't. So we're not going to do any of those because I can't really help you understand them. When the more complex chiasms that are repeating themes, they're usually doing so to compare or contrast ideas. You know, even the antimetabolies compare and contrast good and evil, light and darkness. In the case of JFK's speech, he's contrasting the selfish person who wants what he can get from the government and the patriot who wants to give to his, although he says, well, he says your country, not the government. The patriot who wants to give back to his people. You got to be careful with what words you're using because words are loaded. They mean so many different things to different people. A chiasm doesn't always have a single axis. I mean, as you can see in this Isaiah passage, the axis is actually a triple chiasm, 3 separate chiasms in the center, rather than a single point. It's usually a single central point in the middle of a chiasm. You know, you have a parallel here, a parallel here, another parallel, and in the center, you'll have a single statement. But a lot of chiasms don't have a single statement in the middle. They'll have a parallelism, or like in this case, a pair of chiasms or a triad of chiasms. It can get pretty complicated. If there's a lot of gaps or intervening text in the chiasm, you know, I talked about how chiasms are frequently lopsided. Like you can have a whole paragraph on this point and just a single sentence on this point over here. If there's a lot of text that doesn't seem to fit into any of your points, that's a danger sign. You're either missing a point in the chiasm, or it might not be a chiasm at all. You might just be seeing a pattern or imposing a pattern on the text that isn't really there. Just something to be aware of for now. We'll go over some rules for testing what you think might be a chiasm in part 5. All right, so as we already pointed out in this passage, there are lots of substructures, parallelisms, chiasms, anaphora, all kinds of things that can be going on all at the same time. So, but why chiasms in particular? Like I said, it's used to compare 2 ideas, and this is what's called a synthetic chiasm. Here we go with more Greek words. You don't have to know these words, you just have to know the ideas. But if it helps you to know the words, to keep it all straight, go ahead and take notes. It'll also be in the glossary that I'll post later on. A chiasm that has 2 ideas, like the one at Mount Sinai with Jethro on one side and Moses on the other side. This is a synthetic chiasm that is comparing 2 different things that are really the same idea. Then you could be contrasting 2 ideas. This is called an antithetic chiasm. There's an example. I'm going to keep coming back to these 2 examples, I think, throughout this whole course. There's another example in Genesis comparing Judah and Joseph. During this story of Joseph's life, it kind of interrupts the story and goes back to Judah for a while. And it tells the story of Judah and this woman who was dressed as a prostitute and his, you know, all of his terrible mistakes he made with women. And then it goes back to Joseph and it talks about Joseph and Potiphar's wife. So the point in putting these 2 stories together is to contrast the characters of Joseph and Judah. Like both of these men represent Messiah figures in the story, but Judah, for the first half of the story, represents an anti-Messiah. He only redeems himself much later. But for the first part, he's the leader of the family, he's the guy in charge, but he's making all the mistakes he can because he doesn't have the character it takes to be the head of the nation. Not yet. So narrative progression, the chiasm with Jethro and Moses is somewhat of a narrative progression because it starts with Moses leading the children of Israel out to the wilderness, out to Sinai, and then it goes to Jethro leading Moses' family, except it actually tells the story of Jethro in reverse so that all the points line up with the story of Moses. So it's kind of a narrative progression. And this is called a sympathetic chiasm. I'm not really sure why it's called a sympathetic. I guess because the second half doesn't perfectly align with the first half, but it is following the same progress in the story. So a narrative progression means that the chiasm is telling a story from beginning to end, and the climax of the story is just in the middle. If I tell you a story about, I got in my car, I drove down the driveway, I got on the road, I went to the grocery store, and while I was at the grocery store, all these great things happened. And then I got in my car and I got back on the highway and I drove home and I got into my driveway and I pulled up to my house and I got out of the car. That's a chiasm with a narrative progression, a sympathetic chiasm. There's not a lot of that in the Bible. That's something that you'll see a lot more of in fiction. But most of the fiction that we're used to likes to put the climax of the story right at the end. However, if you look at the subplots in a good novel, you will see lots of subplots going on. Like the main character begins his story as terribly flawed. Terrible things happen to him. And by the end, he has redeemed himself and become this great person. But throughout the middle, there's this story arc, the hero's journey. And that's a narrative progression because the climax where the character becomes who he needs to be to get to the climax of the story is usually more in the middle of the story than at the end, because he can't get to the climax of the story unless he is who he needs to be to bring it there. So you'll find lots of subplots. A good writer will make lots of very subtle use of things like chiasms. Poetic form. When we talk about poetry, we usually think of rhyme and rhythm, meter. Hebrew poetry doesn't use a lot of rhyme and meter. Instead, it uses puns and literary structures. It uses anaphora and antimetaboly. You'll find a lot of antimetaboly chiasms, very simple reversals, and you'll find a lot of parallelisms in the Psalms and the Proverbs and all the poetic books. Mnemonic device, which we already mentioned. Emphasizing a point, constructing an allegory. These are things that these are all the same things that all literary structures are used for. They're used for emphasizing points, mnemonic devices, poetic forms, but it's really in the allegory where chiasms really take center stage like a chiasm. Chiasms in the way that they can tell two stories side by side and contrast them, or give two sets of commandments side by side and draw parallels between things that don't seem to be connected until you really think about how those things were carried out in the culture where they were given. And then you discover all kinds of new meaning that you didn't know was there. And it's because it's making allegorical connections between different kinds of points. And a chiasm is really useful for that. Oh, yeah. Regina pointed out that there is a narrative progression, a sympathetic chiasm in the flood story. And there are actually there are several chiasms embedded there together. And I've seen that story broken out a couple of different ways. But yeah, that is definitely a chiasm there. When it gets into like the numbers of days. And I think the chiasm that I'm thinking of right now is centered on the destruction of all life in the flood. But the whole thing, even though it talks about 40 days here and 40 days there, or I can't remember the exact numbers, it does tell a story from beginning to end and doesn't do a lot of flip-flopping and reversals, even though the end of the story does tend to reflect the beginning of the story. So I want to look at two extra biblical chiasms. And in part, this is another illustration that just evidence that I'm not making this up. And all the people who talk about chiasms, and if you go search on the internet, you'll find lots of people talking about them. And I think a lot of the websites you'll find have some pretty dubious chiasms. I think a lot of times people will seek patterns and then try to force them into the chiastic framework. And not everything in scripture is a chiasm, but that also doesn't mean that it's all imaginary. Chiasms are real structures that aren't just used in the Bible. They're used in the Hebrew and Greek Bibles, but they're also used in ancient English and ancient Greek literature. So here's one that you've probably never heard of, Wilhelmus, or something like that. I don't speak Dutch or German or any of those languages, so I'm sure I'm butchering that one too. I want to bring this one over onto the screen. Wilhelm is comparing himself to King David. I'm sure this is all political propaganda, but this is actually the national anthem of the Netherlands now. So it begins and ends with a pledge of eternal loyalty. To the King of Spain, I've granted a lifelong loyalty. That's in the first stanza. And in the last stanza, but unto God, the greatest of majesties, I owe obedience first and last, for justice wills it so. And then in the second stanza, he's talking about the end of exile. He's drawing a connection between his own people and the people of Israel. You know, I've tried to live in the fear of God's command, and therefore I've been driven from people, home, and land. But God, I trust, will rate me his willing instrument and one day reinstate me into my government. To the end of his own personal exile. And in the second to last stanza, alas, my flock, to sever is hard on us. Farewell, your shepherd wakes, wherever dispersed you may dwell. Pray God that he may ease you, his gospel be your cure. Walk in the steps of Jesus, spelled differently because it's in German or Dutch or whatever the original language was. This life will not endure. And also because it rhymed. Actually, I think that's not a translation. Whoever translated this used Jesu or Yesu instead of Jesus, or because it rhymes with you. But in the second stanza, he's talking about his own exile and his return. In the second to last, he's talking about the exile of his people. And the whole thing, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, it's fairly long. But the whole thing goes through it in the same pattern until he gets to the end where he compares himself to King David. Seems a little pompous, a little over the top, but it does show that chiasms are not something that's isolated just to the Bible. They are everywhere. And clearly this was deliberate. This wasn't something that just happened. Whoever wrote this, whether, I doubt that it was Wilhelmus himself or Wilhelm, he probably had a scribe write it for him, or a poet. But that poet understood the concept of chiasms. And apparently this concept was lost to Western culture for many centuries and then rediscovered by academics just in the last 50 or so years. So back to the two extra biblical chiasms, back to JFK. Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. Another antimetabole, a very simple chiasm. Negotiate on the outside and fear on the inside. And it just makes it easy to remember. And why should you care about chiasms? For all the reasons that chiasms were used. It helps to clarify ideas in scripture. Once you understand that a chiasm may be illustrating an allegory, it's going to give you a whole nother dimension to what might seem like a dry text. There's the genealogy of one clan, then there's Moses and Aaron, and then there's the genealogy of another clan. Why is Moses and Aaron right in the middle here? That's because it's comparing these two clans in their relationship to Moses and Aaron. There's a reason why it's laid out the way it is. John makes use of chiasms. And what does John mean when he says that the light came into the world and the darkness couldn't comprehend it? Well, when you look at the structure of that paragraph, I mean, John explains it eventually, but if you look at the structure of that paragraph and how the points relate to each other, well, the darkness is the anti-Messiah theology that was keeping the Jewish people away from God's actual instructions. There was this darkness that had overcome the land, and they couldn't see Messiah because of these blinders that had been put on them by the religious system of the day. But the darkness wasn't able to, when it says couldn't comprehend it, it doesn't mean that he couldn't understand it. It means that he couldn't overcome it. But that darkness couldn't keep the people from seeing the light that Messiah brought with him. Additional information about the text or the story, and that's clear in the story of Moses and Jethro coming out to Mount Sinai. Understanding types and allegories, like types of Messiah in the stories of Moses and Joshua and Judah and Joseph. All of these people are messianic figures who represent different roles that the Messiah plays, or represent the same roles from different perspectives. And seeing them in the literary structures really helps to clarify that, revealing subtle connections between different ideas. And this is especially true in the Torah when we're getting into specific commandments. Why is this seemingly random series of commandments in the order that it is? Well, it's not random at all. These commandments are in this specific order because this one relates to this one and this one relates to this one. And when you you really understand the commandments when you start to understand the relationship between them. And one of the most interesting parts of chiasms is it gives you a glimpse into the mind of the authors. It helps you see how they thought about their subjects. When you see that the author connects this idea with this idea, and we're going to see one of these in, I believe it's in the Psalms, an idea that the poor people and the land are one and the same in the mind of a particular writer, that really gives a lot of depth to a text. So we've covered introduction to chiasms, talked about literary devices in the Bible, all kinds of big fat Greek words. Like I said, I'll post a list of those later so you can refer back to them. Parallelisms, chiasms, looked at a few extra biblical chiasms just for some perspective, and talked about why they're important. And so next week, we're going to talk about some specific chiasms. We'll take apart a parallelism in Psalm 5, a very short chiasm in Matthew, a longer chiasm in Exodus 13, and a really long and complicated one in Genesis. And then later we'll get into, all the actually mapping out chiasms. We'll talk about some more examples and get to that chiasm enhanced living in part 5. So we're just about at an hour, but I'm not going to call it quits, because I'm hoping that you have questions and some thoughts of your own to add here. And this is the time to do that. If you've been taking notes, if you have any questions written down, feel free to bring them up.
I don't really have any questions right now. I'm going to be contemplating over the discussion you just had with us. There was a lot that actually was very understandable. It did bring a lot of light to on how to determine what one saying, what one verse, how it connects itself into another verse in another book. So it's right now, I don't personally have any questions, but they're kind of I had a lot of lights that came on. I was like, oh wow, that makes sense. And
Yeah, well, this was a pretty big info dump. So I
Yeah.
I hope that you'll have some questions. If you think of questions later, feel free to come back into the community and put all your questions in there, and then we can talk about it in the comments there.
Absolutely. I've actually been just started reading in Proverbs. So as I'm reading through, I think it also in Proverbs, I think there's a lot of the parallel chat. I can't quite pronounce it, but a lot of that going on in Proverbs too. It seems like how they'll say one thing and it'll reverse it saying to confirm, and stuff like that. So it's like, yeah, I'll have some more questions on the next week. So
okay, great. Anybody else?
Yep. I'm like Anthony in that this was a great introduction, very well explained. So I don't have a lot of questions, but at this point, I'm sure I will, because I've only recently been introduced to the fact that these even exist in scripture. And as long as I've been doing Bible study, I'm just shocked. I'm like, really? Why didn't I already know this? It's a completely new concept to me.
Well, think about the centuries of Bible scholars that had no idea that these structures were there.
Yeah. Wow. I'm just like mind blown. And I really want to get this, because what I thought I knew about understanding scripture and the way that I've been learning to do it has been fantastic.
Mhm.
But this takes what I've experienced to a whole new level.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I really want to understand how to recognize these and then decipher them, so to speak. So super excited about that.
And I know with the English language, because there could be one word in our language that
Mhm.
has several different meanings. And my wife and I, we talk about this frequently. How confusing that the English language can be compared to the Paleo Hebrew language, and how it, or just an example, and how simple theirs was back then. And so it's kind of like today, in today's world, well, in most of the scriptures, it's like these, thus, and thous. It can get a little bit confusing because
Right.
of, and I
Yeah,
think that
and that's, I tend to discourage people from reading King James or the Geneva Bible or any of those. It's not because they're not good translations, but it's because our language has changed so much that it may seem like you're understanding the text, but you're really not, because the words don't mean what you think they mean.
and that's kind of why we switched. I mean, we're always reproofing. We
Mhm.
got three scriptures that we read out of, so we're always got, if one's open, we got another one that's open because we want to see how much difference there is between one and the
Yeah.
other. And that alone. How do you pronounce that word again, Jay?
Which one?
Chiasms?
Chiasm.
Chiasm. Yeah. And that alone, just between two different scriptures, it almost seems like that can be in that alone. So, but yeah, this has been a very, very good introduction.
One thing, if you're not using some Bible software like eSword or I can't remember the one that somebody suggested the other day, I really recommend that you get something like that.
The word.
Yeah,
Jay,
the
it
word.
was the
Thank you.
word. Yeah.
Thank you. Logos, if you can afford it, something that will show you the Hebrew behind the words, and like King James Concordance, and have multiple translations. Because even though I just said that I don't recommend people read King James, the King James and even more difficult Young's literal translation are really useful tools when analyzing chiasms. The more literal the translation, the better it is. It may be hard to understand the words, but when it comes
Yeah.
to, I should clarify, this is true for small chiasms, like for antimetaboly, because the word order is very important. The shorter the chiasm, the more important the word order is. And in a more modern translation, it gets very loose. The word order doesn't really resemble the Hebrew very much at all. So you have to look at something that's hyper literal to really make sure that you're looking at the right word order. And if you can, look at the Hebrew or the Greek, depending on which part of the Bible you're in.